We will dive deeper into one form of hairstyles now, and the aspect of having agency over one's body and hair is something our next speaker explores in his essay for the exhibition catalogue. Adebayo Quadry Adekanbi, a researcher in sociology at the University of Warwick, focuses on the intersectional politics of queer activism and feminism in Nigeria. Welcome, Adebayo, to share your thoughts on queering hair among the Yoruba, whose communities span Nigeria and Benin. How can an intersectional lens deepen our understanding of photographs such as those by Rotimi Fani Kayode here behind me?
Yeah, hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I think, yeah, we've had such amazing speakers here today, and it's quite a pleasure to be among just great thinkers and people who are conceptualizing hair in such interesting ways. I think has been established throughout this conversation. So my contribution to the catalogue is called Crown and Glory, Queering Hair Among the Yorubas. And I think, yeah, one thing we've established throughout the conversations is how much aesthetics play such a significant role in the daily lives of people, particularly people from a colonized space or people from that have endured colonialism, forced dislocation, and slavery. I will share my screen. Give me 1 second. And this is just a visual aid to give some guidance as to the conversations I'll be having. Now, again, despite the effects of the colonial project to kind of change and obfuscate a lot of traditional African aesthetics, we can see a lot of them have persisted till today. And some of these, again, have been discussed by the previous speaker. As we can see, some of these historical hairstyles have been inspired and reshaped and reformed in so many different ways. However, I think one thing that's also very important for us to do is how we understand and we read and we look at some of these hairstyles, what they mean and how they're represented. And I use this particularly in the context of the Yoruba people and how we understand and can look at some of these pre-colonial cultural practices and spirituality in some of the ways that we do our hair and make our hair in so many different ways. Now, I try and do this from a queer perspective. Now, what do I mean when I talk about queer? Again, the term queer is something that we see as an umbrella term for non-heterosexual, gender non-conforming people. However, in a space where now a lot of African scholars have kind of discussed queerness in the African context and how queerness is embedded in a lot of our cultural practices. So a lot of this example as a Yoruba person, again using Yoruba, in our language, we have no words for he, there's no our language is relatively gender free. We have no words for he, no words for she. We have no words for sister, brother, son, daughter. So I could be literally telling you a story about someone you would never know the gender of the person. So a lot of this allows us to understand how we arranged our societies in ways that we now understand to be queer in today's contemporary societies, gender free, gender pronouns, gender neutral. However, a lot of these are embedded in our cultural practices. And this kind of, again, introduces the idea that gender and sex generally are things that were introduced to these African spaces as opposed to things that were inherent in our cultural fabric. Now, again, this cultural kind of understandings of Yoruba people provides a framework for us to understand queerness among the Yoruba people, not as an abstract concept that we need to kind of wrap our heads around, like we kind of try and understand queerness in this day and age, but as something that's quite tangible and that's grounded in the historical ways that we organize the Yoruba society. So this kind of suggests that queerness, as we understand it now, is not something that was merely tolerated or celebrated within an otherwise unqueer world. The Yoruba world itself was queer. Now, when we try and make a Yoruba sense of Ori, so the head. Now, the head again is what harbors the hair, which like the hair we have on our heads. But the head actually holds a lot of significant spiritual power and spiritual significance among the Yoruba people. And this is because at the heart, the head, which is what we call Ori in Yoruba, the spiritual head is something that we believe to be chosen prior to one's incarnation into the world. So someone's destiny, their purpose in the world, they connect that to the head. And this is something that they choose when they're coming into the world. And as such, the Ori is revered as the seat of one's consciousness and the connections to the divine. And as such, the hair, which crowns the physical manifestation of the Ori, the head, is instilled with a lot of significant symbolic power. And so Yoruba people, we adorn the Ori with intricate hairstyles, with beads, with head wraps, and ways to kind of affirm our connection to the spirituality and align ourselves with, the predetermined path in life that we've chosen. And again, one of the ways that colonialism has really changed this um, and changed how we see some of these practices is particularly can be seen through gendered ways. So some of those, special ways that we adorn our hair are now gendered. So we see some styles as, oh, women only wear this style and men do their hair this way. And, it's little girls that do their hair this way and little boys that do their hair this way. However, what does this mean in a context and a space and a culture where gender was always seen as something that was not binary as opposed, where it was relatively gender free, and gender was seen as something that was, again, an introduction of the colonial project. Now, an example is spirituality and how this is represented in spiritual spaces. So, for example, we have a deity called Shango, and one of Shango worshippers, one of the biggest parts of how they are represented in this day and age is through their cornrowed hair. Now, a lot of these men usually, whenever they are worshiping Shango and they have their long cornrowed hair, a lot of people tend to see these as representations of them trying to express their femininity, because Shango again is seen as this deity who allows men to somehow again express their femininity. And this is how this is being represented, and this is how this is seen. However, when we understand this as a spiritual practice, and again, not necessarily as something that is the way we see it in contemporary days and age, with gender and sex now introduced, we start to understand how actually this was a spiritual practice and not necessarily an expression of femininity. So a lot of them keeping their hair was because once you become indoctrinated into the Shango among Shango worshippers, you weren't allowed to cut your hair anymore. So a lot of them putting their hairs in cornrows and having these beads were more about more about practicality as opposed to them trying to express femininity in a certain way. So this allows us again to reconceptualize how we see these actions, not necessarily as something that are gendered, but as a spiritual practice in itself and as a way for us to understand what it means to worship Shango. It means keeping your hair, it means not cutting it. So it means, again, adorning it in these intricate hairstyles to keep it, again, for practical purposes. Now, what does that mean for how we read artistic practices, particularly those done by Yoruba artists? And this is what you can see here, these two pieces. So Nothing to Lose One, Bodies of Experience, 1989, and Untitled. Both of these pieces are showcased in the exhibition. And both of these pieces by Rotimi Fani-Kayode. Rotimi Fani-Kayode was a Yoruba scholar. Rotimi Fani-Kayode is unfortunately no longer with us, and they died in 1989 due to HIV and AIDS complications at the age of 39. Now, as a Yoruba artist, Yoruba Fani Kayode was not very removed from Yoruba spiritual practices, and he very much infused a lot of Yoruba spiritual practices in his work. However, because of the connections of and the themes that Rotimi Fani Kayode tends to cover, a lot of the times we read Fani Kayode's works in gendered ways, particularly gendered as men and as gay, because these are the kind of representations that we see that we see being represented here. We see gay men. And so when we look at them, we see gay men. So when they, for example, adorn their hairs in these ways, we see it as ways for them to deviate traditional understandings of masculinity. However, my argument is that what we're losing when we see this way is we're losing the spiritual elements that are actually being represented in these photos as well. So again, based on the themes of sexuality, eroticism, and the body that Fani Kayode explores in his works, and his overt connection to the LGBTQI plus identity as an out gay man, he has gathered an extensive audience in the West as someone who depicts the gay body, particularly the Black gay body. And a lot of my issues with how we read Fani Kayode's works lie in these gendered natures, which we interpret them. Since, again, a lot of these that are often portrayed and we understand to be men, and we understand them to be men on gendered terms. And it's easy to see these images as non-conventional portrayals of masculinity, as far as we're concerned. This is a way to show men in another light. However, when this is all we see, we forget the potential that can be read, particularly in the importance of the Ori in Yoruba paradigms. Perhaps what's being portrayed here is the importance of adorning the Ori and not necessarily simply a gendered expression or something that's deviating from normative gender expressions. So the queerness of this specifically lies not in the identity of the photographer or the models, but in the fact that there is a representation here that can be perceived outside of the confines of traditional understandings of gender and sex. So we can all read Fani Kayode's work in this way, through a lens that doesn't simply see the gender and normative frameworks on display, or the normative frameworks that are being deviated from, but we're committed to looking beyond those to actually see the spiritual practices that are also here. Now, again, we understand that Fani Kayode's works kind of travels across time and space. So people are able to read these things in many different ways and in ways that read true to them. And unfortunately, Fani Kayode is no longer here to kind of specify and say specifically, this is what I meant, this is what I meant. But one thing we do know is that, again, Fani Kayode always infused Yoruba spirituality into their works. And this is something, again, that is always often lost whenever we read and we look at Fani Kayode's works, because we are so committed to seeing the bodies that are being represented there and not necessarily the practices and the aesthetics that are there, and how some of these actually say so much about spiritual practices, indigenous religious practices, but also understanding the persistence and insistence of these, again, dynamic and negotiable queer paradigms and structures within cultures that have been, again, pillaged and obfuscated through the colonial project. And yeah, and thank you very much. I hope that's been quite clear, but I hope, well, yeah, a lot of this was kind of an effort for us to re-understand and disrupt how we see some of these pieces. Thank you.